The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. Today's session is going to explore different methods that we can use for measuring multimodal network connectivity. You may be aware that last month, the Federal Highway Administration released a guidebook for measuring multimodal network connectivity, and we're lucky enough to be joined today by members of the project team to really explore that resource and its applications. Excuse me. My name is Dan Jeline. I will be facilitating the webinar today, and I'd like to take a moment here just to introduce the panelists that we have joining us. So first up is Gary Jensen. Gary is the Livability Team Leader at the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Human Environment. He leads programs and activities that improve the human environment and enrich human interaction with transportation systems, including bicyclists and pedestrians. His team advances equality and increased the quality of life during the project development and delivery of transportation projects. We're glad to have Gary joining us today. Hannah Twaddle is a fellow and technical director for integrated transportation planning with ICF. She has more than 30 years of experience in multimodal transportation planning and policy development with local, regional, state, and federal agencies. She's led consultant teams for several FHWA multimodal planning resources, including the guidebook for measuring multimodal connectivity that we'll be discussing today. Kim Boros is here. She's an associate planner and GIS group manager for Alta Planning and Design. She's worked in diverse communities from Washington to New York, assisting people transform their communities into locations where walking and cycling are regular and normal activities. Her professional work is focused on GIS-based modeling, infrastructure planning, network development, and implementation. Finally, Joe Broach is a research associate with the Transportation Research and Education Center, or TREC, and an instructor in the School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University. Joe's work primarily focuses on transportation data, behavior, and modeling. We're really excited to have this panel with us here today, and I'm going to breeze through just a few housekeeping items before we get into the feature presentation. Attendees, I'd like to ask if you can hear me, if you could please raise your hand using the little hand icon located in the GoToWebinar panel. That will just let me know that my audio is coming through and you can hear what I'm saying. Great. Okay, awesome. Thank you all for doing that. As attendees today, you won't have the ability to speak, although you will be able to submit questions and comments to us throughout the session using the questions pod. If you have a question or a comment as we move along, I'd encourage you to place it there and send it in to me. We are going to be holding some time at the end of the session today for a Q&A, and so hopefully if you provide your questions there, I'll be able to get to them toward the end of the session. If you have any issues with your audio, or if you have any problems hearing the webinar, if it freezes up, I'd encourage you to just reload the session and log back in. That should be able to take care of the problem. We are archiving the webinar today. We've already posted the webinar slides as a PDF. So if you go to our website, pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, and navigate to this webinar page, you'll be able to find the PDF copy of the slideshow from today. I'll also send that out in just a few moments via the chat function. We're also recording the webinar, and the recording should be up within 1 to 2 days on that same website. At the end of the webinar today, or later this afternoon, I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email to you that's going to have links to all this information, the webinar archive page, the recording, the presentation slides, all that stuff, so you'll have it right there. You're also going to be receiving in that email later today a link that will allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for this webinar. So it's important that if you are attending this webinar from a site with multiple people, you want to make sure you send that link and that email around to all of them so that they can also submit or generate a certificate of attendance for themselves as well. If you want to stay up to date with PBIC on all the webinars that we have going on, there are a few ways to do that. I've already told you about the webinar archive page that we have set up for all of our upcoming sessions and our archive sessions that we've had in the past. We're also active on social media, and you can follow along using hashtag PBIC webinar today if you're so inclined. You can also sign up for our mailing list where we send messages every time we schedule new sessions and new webinars. I want to mention a couple of webinars that are coming up. You may already be signed up, but if not, these may be topics you're interested in. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing a session on bicycle signals from 1 to 2:30 Eastern Time. with presentations from Peter Kuntz, Rock Miller, and Dave Kirshner. So if bicycle signals are an interest of yours, please consider signing up for that. You can find more information at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars on this one. And then on Monday, we're having another session on using crash types to understand pedestrian and bicyclist safety. This one is hosted by the FHWA Office of Safety. We're going to hear from panelists from Florida and Arizona about work they're doing to type their crash data and use it to really make better decisions about safety improvements. So again, that one's happening on Monday. I'll send out the registration links in just a moment so you can get signed up for these if you're interested. One last thing I want to mention before we start the presentations is that we have submitted this webinar and it's been approved by the AICP for 1 CM credit. So if you're a planner looking to report those credits, you can navigate to their event page and find that information there. I do want to take one poll question actually before we get started. This is an attendance poll. We just want to hear from you all about how many folks are out there from each site. So you may be just attending on your own from your site. You may have 2 or 3 people with you, 4 or 5, 6 or 7. We just want to get a better handle on how many people are out there. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and voting in this poll, we will move right along into the presentations right after that. All right. Thank you all very much for voting. I'm going to go ahead and close this down in just a couple of seconds. All right. We will now close that. Thank you very much. We're going to get right into our presentations. And as I'm turning the screen over to Hannah Twaddle for our first presentation, I'd like to ask Gary Jensen from FHWA. Gary, if you would like to give just a quick overview of the webinar and introduction from your perspective at FHWA.
Thanks, Dan, and hello, everyone. On behalf of the Federal Highway Administration, I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar highlighting our latest resource on measuring multimodal network connectivity. It's the goal of the U.S. Department of Transportation to invest in infrastructure to ensure safety, mobility, and accessibility, and to stimulate economic growth, productivity, and competitiveness for American workers and businesses. To achieve this goal, FHWA provides guidance, technical assistance, and research that leverages federal funding, accelerates project delivery, reduces project lifecycle costs, and optimizes the operation and performance of existing facilities. In particular, we are working with our stakeholders to facilitate the financing, development, and implementation of multimodal transportation projects that improve connectivity, accessibility, safety, and convenience for all users. This guidebook supports these objectives. With its use, we hope transportation agencies can foster a safe transportation system and reduce crashes, fatalities, and injuries. Increase transportation choices for individuals to provide more freedom on transportation decisions. Expand access to essential services for communities across the country. Improve connectivity for citizens to jobs, healthcare, and other critical destinations, including in rural communities. Accelerate project delivery, increase accountability, prioritize infrastructure investments, and partner with the private sector. I want to thank the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center and the UNC Highway Safety Research Center for hosting this webinar. And I also want to thank the consultant team you're going to hear from today. And of course, thank you all again for participating. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Hannah.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on which part of the planet you're sitting in as you view this webinar. I'm Hannah Twaddle with ICF. I'm going to be joined today by a couple of my team members who worked very hard on this project, and it's been a delight. Throughout the presentation today, you'll be hearing from Kim Boros from Alta Planning and Design and from Joe Broach at Portland State University. I did want to give a shout out not only to Gary Jensen from Federal Highway, but Christopher Dowis, the reviewers you see on the screen who all played a strong role in helping to shape the concepts that went into this project and the ideas. And a special thanks to Dan Goodman, who launched this project and carried it through quite far while he was with Federal Highway Administration before he went on to work in the private sector. I'm excited to see how life continues in good, solid bicycle and pedestrian resources from all of these brilliant minds you see on the screen. It's been a real privilege to work with everyone. This particular guidebook, Measuring Multimodal Network Connectivity, is really something of a companion book to one that came out about a year before, the Guidebook for Developing Pedestrian and Bicycle Performance Measures. So I would encourage you, as you peruse this resource we're going to talk about today, to also take the time, if you haven't already, to take a look, download this other companion guidebook that came out earlier, because it provides a lot of detail and backstory on a number of the measures that we discuss in this guidebook. We do talk about the measures in this guidebook, but there is a little bit of assumed knowledge. We don't drill all the way down to the level of detail that the previous guidebook did intentionally, because that's already out there. So I think you should be able to pick up on the ideas and the concepts here today with this webinar and with the resources that are available. But I would also encourage you to take a look at that companion guide, as well as the phenomenal array of other resources Federal Highway and the Fed Bike Info Center have made available. The methodology for this particular process to develop this guidebook involved both a practice of the scan of the practice around the nation and to some degree the world, took a look at current research and planning work. We conducted not only phone interviews with a number of agencies, but also did some case studies with 5 selected agencies that we'll be describing in a few minutes that really helped to inform our research. And we also had some informal sort of group discussions, for instance, at the Transportation Research Board conference a couple of years ago, where we just sort of set up a room and had people drop in. So lots of ways that we collected information formally and informally to help inform this project. Before I go further, you get to practice again with your polling tool. So Dan, if you want to pop up the poll, I'm not sure if I'll see it on my screen, but you tell me when it's up. Sure. We're going to ask folks to type in great. So Dan, if you want to just read through the options as people are voting, and then when the poll closes, if you can show the results on screen and let us know what they look like. That would be great.
So we're asking you to just let us know, what kind of agency are you with? Are you with a federal agency, a state agency, regional or local agency? That would be like MPO, RPO, a city or county, a nonprofit or a consultant group or something else. And if you fit into the other category, let us know who you're with, and I'll try to read off some of those as well as we go. So we'll leave this open for about maybe 5 more seconds, and then we'll turn it around and actually show you all kind of who's on the line and who your peers are here. Okay. All right. And apologies to those of you who appear to be having trouble with my audio. I'll try to be a little more clear, but the rest of the team sounds pretty good, so that's the important part. So some universities out there in the other category. Let me shut this down and share it with you all so you can see who's on the line. About equal parts regional and local agencies, 37%, and then nonprofit or consultants, 38%. So those who picked other in 4%, some universities are out there and a few others, maybe health injury prevention groups. State agencies, about 14% of you represent state agencies, and 6% are with federal agencies. So a good mix, but mostly in the regional, local, or nonprofit and consultant world here today.
That's great, Dan. Thank you so much. And it's really helpful to get a sense of the cross-section of folks that are interested in this topic, in part because we not only need connectivity on our physical networks, we also need connectivity across agencies. This process of planning for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure and active transportation is very much a group effort among federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, regional agencies, and nonprofits and universities. Everybody on this call is really part of the infrastructure we need to collect the data, to assemble the data, to analyze the data, and to ultimately apply the information to make better decisions, which is what this guidance is really all about and really what we do. So let's take a few minutes to get a couple of definitions of terms down for the purpose of what we're talking through. So what is multimodal connectivity? We, of course, had to work on defining it properly and run that through several committees and boards and up and down to make sure it all worked. But we were pretty comfortable with talking about networks as being accessible, interconnected, pedestrian and bicycle transportation facilities that allow all users, so all ages, all abilities, to safely and conveniently get where they want to go. And you can certainly add words to that like comfortably as well, but we wanted to keep it reasonably succinct. And then connectivity is the extent to which you can actually conduct a trip from beginning to end and travel throughout a community comfortably. So that's just a little bit of background on sort of how we had to really make sure we were being clear on the networks we were talking about and the concept of connectivity we were discussing. What's the point? Why do we do this? It really comes down to ultimately allowing us to take a look at where we are now in terms of the level of connectivity of our bicycle and pedestrian networks so that we can figure out where we need to go. So particularly when we're looking at connectivity, what you see is places that are well connected and places where we have gaps of some sort. They might be physical gaps, they might be comfortability gaps, they might be convenience gaps. There's lots of different kinds of gaps, and we'll talk about that. But really, the process of analyzing multimodal connectivity allows you to figure out where those gaps are so that you can set your goals, identify your performance measures, track your progress, try different alternative solutions and compare them. Ultimately, figure out which of the gaps are the most urgent and important so that you can set priorities for investing in projects that are going to close those gaps, and so that you'll get as much value as possible. As many of you probably know on this call, sometimes making a very small investment in a weak link in the chain, just a small investment that doesn't look like much, can have a huge ripple effect that really improves connectivity for a great number of people. And of course, ultimately, we do want to have people be able to use all the modes of transportation that are available to them and use active transportation easily in order to advance safety and equity and our own health and our own quality of life. So this is why we do it and where it's headed and for whom we do it. This is a wonderful little graphic that I hope you see on your screen. Who needs this? Multimodal connectivity. I think it's Roger Gellert in Portland who was one of the people that came up with this concept, and I love the little picture of bicyclists, but there are a small group of folks relatively, and the research that Joe and his team in Portland State have done, and Jennifer Dill up there, have kind of borne this out intuitively and from research around the country. Small chunk of folks towards the top of the pyramid would probably ride almost no matter what in terms of bicycling, for instance, and this just covers cyclists. But there's a large chunk of folks, you know, really more than half of us, that would like to ride or try to, but we worry, we're not comfortable. And then there's a small sector of folks, you know, right now it's about a third of the population that says they have no interest in doing this. And so that's fine. There's still plenty of folks that want to. And so we're really trying to make sure that that group of folks, that 60% in that gray area that are interested but concerned, or move up into that enthused and confident group, right? And perhaps we can pull some of those folks from the no way, no how group up into the happier sector of enthused and confident folks. There may be reasons that they're the no way, no how folks that have to do with accessibility for people with disabilities or comfort levels or age that could be resolved if we make our systems more comfortable. I want to take a few minutes to highlight the wonderful folks that we worked with and tell their stories, because that'll help put these sort of abstract concepts we'll go into in a few minutes about methods and measures kind of into a context of real life here. So we had 5 agencies that worked with us over the course of the project. Atlanta Regional Commission, and I give a shout out to Byron Rushing for all of his work working with our team on that. The City of Baltimore, Valerie LeCoeur and Jay Decker. Caltrans, the DOT for the state of California, and Sergio Ruiz worked with us from there. Fort Collins and Tessa Greger, and Portland Metro with Lake Meteague, all did a lot of work with us to test out measures, to try applying them in new ways, to see what lessons we could learn. And we're going to share with you some of just the highlights. This report cover you see on your screen is the cover of the detailed write-ups of those case studies. So I encourage you to download that as well as the guidebook. They're both available from the Federal Highway website. But we'll just spend a couple of minutes highlighting, what we did in each of those regions to give you just a taste of the sorts of things people do with measuring multimodal connectivity. So I'm going to talk through Atlanta, and then Kim Boros is going to talk through the following three, and then I'll wrap up talking about Portland. In Atlanta, some of you may know the Regional Commission there has a wonderful program called the Livable Communities Initiative that encourages local planning for all sorts of types of modes of transportation that contribute to community livability. And when you do your plans, you then are in a better position to be able to compete successfully for regional funding for infrastructure. And so this project was really making an effort to try to improve the level of sort of quality and of consistency of the way that, in this case, bicycle connectivity measures and methods could be applied at that local scale. So even though Atlanta Regional Commission covers a huge territory and does do region-wide bicycle and pedestrian planning, the reality was we need those local plans and those local measures and methods to become something that we can roll up to that regional scale and benefit both the locality and the region. So we took a look at 5 sort of drill down study areas, took pieces of the region that tried to represent kind of different settings and contexts, ranging from the very urban center downtown and sort of walkable areas of Decatur through the more suburban centers of Perimeter and out towards Woodstock, and then one of the historic neighborhoods in the city as well. So we tried to pick some different contexts to take a look at the nuances of how each one of those areas represented a fairly common problem in terms of connectivity. And I'll show you just one of the 5. Again, this is a good teaser to go read the whole set of case studies, but took a look at some before and after pictures by looking at not only the just the network that was there and is planned. So you see on the left there the images that how the plan would add to the physical network in terms of connectivity. But we also looked at it from the aspect of travel stress. So how much would the investments that the region and the locality were thinking about also help to improve the comfort level and reduce the level of stress on the network. So that was a really interesting project that allowed us to look at a couple of different measures. And again, we'll circle back in a few minutes and tell you a little bit more about what those are, but this gives you a chance to see what they look like. Kim, I'm going to ask you to pick up and just describe a little bit about what we were doing in Baltimore.
Thanks, Hannah. So you can see here the city of Baltimore. What we were looking at within the city of Baltimore is how to think about pedestrian connectivity when you have a robust built-out network. Baltimore has been around for long enough that they have sidewalks almost everywhere. So the question we were asking is, once your sidewalk network is complete, are you done? Or what other ways can you use to think about improvements where the network might be great, where it might need a little bit of love to become accessible for people with of all ages and abilities, people that might have mobility impairments, and where there might be additional improvements that we could make. So we looked at the network in downtown Baltimore from a couple of different perspectives. Here you can see purely the presence and absence of sidewalk on the left-hand side. Things look pretty good. And then on the right-hand side, we used a pedestrian level of traffic stress model developed by the Oregon Department of Transportation, which focuses more on accessibility for people with mobility impairments. And what you can see is there are definitely places where mobility can be improved. So this, there is potential for this metric to be used as part of a complete streets neighborhood level planning effort as an objective tool to evaluate the pedestrian environment and look at improvements. Moving into Caltrans District 4, For those of you out there, you can see District 4 is the San Francisco Bay Area, and this area itself is the size of small states. This was part of the first bike plan that is done at a regional highway district. One of the things we were thinking about is what does it mean for a regional highway district to be planning for bicyclists? And one of the things that we started looking at is the quality of travel along and across state highway facilities. So what is the barrier or opportunity that's created by state highway facilities where the DOT has jurisdiction? We used a route directness index or an RDI, which is a tool that you can use to basically look at out of direction travel. So how permeable are the state highway networks and what is the quality of the crossings? So with this, we were able to measure the potential for crossing at regular intervals across all of the state roadways and help target improvements to make connections to local bicycle networks. So this small case study has actually had a pretty big impact, and you can see it in the Caltrans District 4 plan, which was published just about a month ago, I believe. So moving on to Fort Collins, the city of Fort Collins was working on a transportation master plan update at the time when we visited about a year ago. One of the things that we were thinking about is how to take the network, the bicycle network, which is already fantastic, to the next level. The city of Fort Collins was also looking for a connectivity evaluation tool, which is replicable over time and could be used at a variety of scales with common definitions that were agreed on through each government or portion of the DOT. So we looked at level of traffic stress. We looked at a 5-point LTS, which had been done for their previous bicycle plan, and compared that to the standard definition Mineta level of traffic stress, which is an LTS 4, 1 through 4 scale, and looked at the difference in quality based upon how you define your accessibility metrics.
And Kim, what's really the sort of core difference between the 5-point and the 4-point method?
Really the core difference is the 5-point method relied upon a lot of data that was collected specifically for the planning effort and hasn't been updated over time, while the 4-point method was using data that's more consistently collected across their network, so it was easier to measure as they move ahead.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you see an example there of how using your knowledge about your available data and being flexible can provide you with resources that you may not have even thought you had. The last case study, I'll just give a little insight on Portland Metro. This one could take the rest of, these all could take the whole rest of the hour. So we're going to do them very, very quickly. But in Portland, we wanted to try to look at a whole variety of measures. At the same time, there's a lot of really rich resources in that agency in terms of analysis tools and GIS resources. So we wanted to try to overlay quite a number of different indicators and compare them to the plan that was out there, which also is quite robust, and see if we can get some new, fresh insights by overlaying some of the data that we could be generating and calculating, and also see if there are ways to simplify the measures. So this was an interesting exercise that allowed us to take a look at, when you really sort of put a lot of information together that can be very complex, does it come out with something that's usable, and are there opportunities to simplify the way we use the measures, the way we combine them, and the way we look at them. And there's a number of really interesting maps and outcomes that you can read about in the case study, but one of the big takeaways I think that we found as we were wrapping through that project was when we sort of overlaid all these varieties. I think we've got 7, or so different metrics that we were pulling together into overlays here to take a look at where the planned improvements were really filling gaps and helping to improve connectivity. Was it matching up in terms of the bikeway investments primarily being around sort of the perimeter areas of the main core city and the pedestrian emphasis really focusing on the downtown area and some of the gaps and connections within the city and the urban area. We definitely did see, it was helpful to see the sort of validation of how these measures all sort of resonated with the plan. So I think there was some sense of that. There was also a takeaway that it would be helpful to look at more deeply at some of the accessibility measures, not just accessibility for people with disabilities, but mostly more accessibility for access to destinations and equity, which is a really important topic area in Portland. So it gave some rise to some creative conversations about where they want to go next, and I'm excited to see where they will go next with all of this, especially because Elliot Rose, who started this project when he was at ICF, is now with Portland Metro. And so I know that that project is going to carry forward there. So I'd like to ask Dan to open up in the next poll and give you all a chance to reflect for a minute on some of the kinds of connectivity issues that we were dealing with in these communities. Do any of them resonate with you? We're just curious.
Yeah,
Dan?
so you'll see the poll now. You can pick as many of these as apply to you. And unfortunately, we didn't have space for all the options that Hannah and her team had on the slide there. But are any of these pretty common to you? Which of the connectivity issues applies to your community? And while you're offering your thoughts, I just wanted to mention to Hannah and the team that someone brought up already one that I didn't see listed here, but is really important, and that's the idea of railroad corridors serving as barriers in the network. And that's a really important one, and we didn't list it here, but that's certainly something. I wonder if that came up, I guess, when you were doing your work for these case studies.
We did talk about it, I think, particularly in Atlanta when we were on our site visit and discussions with them. We had some interesting conversations about new analysis tools and treatments for handling that particular issue and design strategies for handling rail crossings. I think that the experience in California, the route continuity and interruptions analysis might be very applicable to also looking at railways as barriers, because it's a very similar in that sense kind of physical barrier that could be traversed. It's a little more politically tricky perhaps with rail, but physically it can be done. Yeah,
absolutely. So it looks like we've got about a good number of folks have voted in this one. So let me just close it here and we'll see what everyone thought, and I'll share the results. And I'll read them out for those who can't see. So the leading scorer here, and obviously these are going to add up to more than 100 because you picked more than one per person or per vote. But physical gaps in the network led with, heavy or fast-moving traffic led with 84%. And then just behind it, 83% of folks mentioned physical gaps in the network. So those being two big ones. Tied at 59% of people picked the sparse network or low density, as well as the distance between maybe origins and destinations or just places themselves. So 59% each of those. And then 51% mentioned broken pavement, but still over half of people mentioning each of these issues, some more than others. But it's pretty common, it seems like, from the results.
Thank you, Dan. That's fascinating, and it definitely reinforces, I think, the experience that the folks in the case studies had and the research we did, that this is very much, connectivity is very much something that is not just a physical definition of the infrastructure. It's very much an intertwined concept that it's not enough just to build a new link in the chain. We also have to look at how comfortable not only that link is, but how the whole chain is. And sometimes your barriers to connectivity are much more about the quality of the existing network than they are about the physical gaps or distances. And sometimes they're about the land development patterns. So there's several different angles from which we look at connectivity. I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of those are now in the remaining time we have before we open up for questions from the chat pod. And I think Dan said, go ahead and type questions in as you go. He'll be opening those up to us and sharing them with us, and we'll try to address them in a few minutes. But I'll just run through real quickly the basic structure of this particular guidebook. We describe a process, and then we provide short briefs, fact sheets, both on the 5 core methods that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then also on a handful of analysis tools and measures that are fairly commonly applied or could be commonly applied. We tried to stick with things that folks could probably use with the tools they have. And again, I'd encourage you to drill down in the guidebook on performance measures for even more detail on some of these analysis methods and measures. But the overarching process is not unlike a good planning process in general. You take a look at your overall context and the reason for why you're doing this, which is step one, and that's really probably almost the most important step of the process, because if you get that wrong, the rest of it's not going to come up with the answers you need. But then you work through a process of figuring out which tools and methods work for you, and then pulling together the data, running the computations, and perhaps at the other end, very importantly, thinking through how you actually package the results so they support good decision making. So in that first step, identifying the planning context, there's really just a couple things to think about. So one would be, where are you in your transportation decision-making process? So this graphic you, I hope, are seeing on your screen comes out of one of the recent briefing books from USDOT that just describes the classic transportation decision-making process, not just the long-range planning process and programming process that MPOs are typically involved in, but also moving through the whole cycle of project development. So that would be designing, buying the right-of-way, conducting NEPA analysis if you need those, and so forth. There's decisions to be made at that level as well, and these analysis tools can apply there, and in the long-term operation of the system. So again, analysis tools can help to support improving the way the system functions and operates, even as you're using it and as you're owning it. So that's one element, is to think, where is the information we're developing going to feed in? What kind of part of the process is it going to inform? And it may be more than one part. I think the other key thing to think about in the planning context is then, once you've kind of zeroed in on how the information you're developing is going to be used within that process, then it's, what are the questions we really need to answer? And again, where do those, what kind of vehicles are those going to be put into to be acted upon? So for instance, in the California case, we were looking at route directness. We were looking at how are we going to deal with these large highways that are effectively acting as barriers. And so we needed to be thinking about the relevant plans and policies, local connectivity around the barrier or street, the networks that folks could use to navigate, or did use to navigate, to try to make the trip work, and then where are the strategic points where we could consider looking at collaborating among agencies politically and geographically between the state and the localities. And then finally thinking through what's the scale of the analysis. Some places are very fine-grained, and some are quite regional or even statewide. So all of those are factors that go into the next step, which is talking about what's the method you actually want to use, having thought that through, to answer those questions and help support that. And we came up with essentially a commonality of 5 major methods for assessing connectivity in specific ways. And the way we've done this graphic, we've actually showed 4 of them down the left of your screen, and then the 5th method is really kind of one that can be overarchingly applied to the other 4 or to anything else. So the 4 sort of core methods have to do with looking at how complete the network is. So again, sort of just where the physical link breaks are, right? How dense the network is. So how much richness do you have? How many choices do you have? How many options do you have for being able to make your trip, in this case, on a bicycle or by foot? How direct is the network? So there are tools that look at that. The California study we were talking about, that was very much a route directness type of study, where how far do you have to go out of your way in order to use a comfortable, safe facility? And then finally, the accessibility to destinations method that really looks at, is there somewhere to go once you've used this facility? Does it take you to places you need to go? Is it really accessing what people want to do and where they want to go? which involves overlaying the infrastructure with the land uses underneath. And what you can see that's an important takeaway message for this is that your decision about the type of network you're going to study, which Joe is going to talk about in just a minute, is a really important element in what answers you get out of looking at those different measures. And that kind of takes you to the network quality measure. That would be level of traffic stress, right, or level of service, some of those things we mentioned earlier. So, for example, in this graphic, for a network completeness analysis, if you defined your base network as just any facility that, in this case, bicyclists could use, so just every street that bicyclists are allowed on, and you set your bar at that scale in terms of the quality and type of the network, it would look like you had an 80% completeness ratio in this imaginary hypothetical place. If you narrowed your filter down to just specific facilities that were designated as bike routes, suddenly that drops down to only 25% of your network now is complete. And then if you further restrict yourself to only the facilities that are considered some level of good quality and low stress, your answers would come down to about only 18% of your network is complete. So you really see a dramatic difference in how you set the bar to begin with in defining the network that you're going to be looking at and what a difference it makes. That can just be an educational tool in and of itself. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe to talk a little bit about the steps 3 to 5 in this process where you actually do the analysis itself. So Joe, do you want to pick up and talk about those?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so Kim and I are going to take you on a very quick journey through the actual process of measuring connectivity, and that was the real focus of the guidebook to try to sort of show the steps that it takes so that agencies and others doing this have an idea of sort of what you're getting into and what to think about up front once you identify the planning context. So if we go to the next slide, your first step when you're doing connectivity analysis, you're grappling with data. And it really is a data assembly, as we've termed it, in that it's generally not going to exist in a single source. So agencies are encouraged to think about what they have in-house, what external sources are available to them, and the guidebook mentions some of those, such as OpenStreetMaps and federal highways data and other sources. And as Hannah already alluded to, the core of any connectivity analysis is your network of streets and how they connect to one another. And defining the network is just pivotal to getting the analysis to provide the answers and the information that you need. And we divided this into basically 3 categories of ways that research and practice has been defining networks. In one method, you might take all of the streets that are available for walking and biking just in a legal sense, but that sort of leaves you short of understanding where people actually are want to walk and bicycle, where they actually likely will. The next step up in complexity is to think about a facility-based network. So using data on your designated bicycle facilities, on sidewalks and connections, you can get a little bit better sense of the parts of the network that are more attractive to walking and bicycling. And then finally, I think as the Baltimore case study really illustrated well, that can leave you short too, because it doesn't get at those issues of quality of the network. And that's sort of the highest next step up in complexity. Methods such as level of service, level of traffic stress will help get you there. So assembling the street network data consists sort of 2 categories. And the first is that bicycle, pedestrian, and pedestrian facility data. And that consists of both your designated facilities and the guidebook. You see a snippet of a table there where we've done our best to help agencies define the range of facility types that might exist for bicycling and walking. Also, those intersection features are really important and less likely to be captured in existing data sets. And then things like slope. As the poll question earlier illustrated, though, that's designated facilities aren't enough. If there's heavy traffic alongside or other barriers to connectivity, you need supporting data on design characteristics, traffic volumes, and speeds, and those sorts of things. There's also a distinction between two types of measure. The first we think of as sort of form-based or potential connectivity, where you're just adding up all of the designated facilities in an area. But probably more useful for a lot of planning contexts are those route-based measures that you've already been hearing about. And those are the ones that can take into account barriers such as the railroads that were brought up in a question, interstates, or other gaps in connectivity. For that, you also need some people in place data, because the end goal of connectivity is to get people from where they are to where they're going. And with that, Dan is going to launch another poll asking you to tell us about what you know about your non-motorized networks, and then it's going to pass over to Kim, who's going to give you an idea of how these metrics are actually computed.
Yeah, so we just picked a few of these measures, not being able to fit them all. A few of the things that you might have a handle on, whether you have an inventory of some of your on-road facilities, know where your crossing locations are, the presence of sidewalks, maybe the quality of those, number of lanes. We've also got some information here about traffic volumes and or speed. So maybe take a moment, just pick the items that you have access to, or the data that's available to use, and then we'll show the results and then get into more about how it's used and where it comes from. So just take a few more seconds to cast your vote on these, and we'll share the results with the group. Just while folks are voting, just to let the panel know, a lot of interest in this topic of the quality of the network being one of the really critical pieces, and kind of knowing where stuff is good, but knowing that it's high quality and that it's the type of facility that really does promote safety and comfort for all ages and abilities really seems to be a priority for most of our audience. All right, let me close down the poll. It looks like most people have voted, and we've got quite a bit more to get through, so let me do that and then share the results. So 82% was the leading score, traffic volumes or speed. People seem to have that information, as well as 81% said number of lanes. So those are available. 79% of people, also a near leading contender, said that they have a good handle on their on-road facilities, whether those are bike lanes, bicycle boulevards, and other things. Sidewalk inventory is pretty common as well. 61% of people have that. The crossing inventory is about a third of attendees said that they know where those are. And that's interesting, because we recently did another webinar on conducting crossing inventories, and they're not as common in a lot of places, at least from what we found too. So this seems to reflect that. So I'll turn things back over to you all, Joe.
Great. So I'm going to ask Kim to talk a little bit about just a handful, a little teaser of these various methods and metrics. Kim?
Thanks, Hannah. Next on our whirlwind tour, in the fact book, in the guidebook, we have fact sheets on each of the connectivity analysis methods. Those are represented in the 4x4 metric that Hannah showed previously. In interest of time, you'll see that we have network completeness, some pros, and then some things for consideration as you move through each of these methods of looking at connectivity. So this is network density. As Joe mentioned, it's a form-based measure. It looks at how much, but it doesn't necessarily look at where the people are. So considering quality can add to that more meaningful metric. Route directness is really starting to look at where the people are. It can require significant data preparation, but again, it can be a really robust analysis and help develop alternatives. And then the one, access to destinations, is another people-based metric, which is looking at identifying and prioritizing projects. Again, the more complicated the method, the more labor and data intensive it can be, and that's a time when automation and the increasing computing power is really getting to be something that's useful that we can use in cycling and pedestrian planning. Finally, network quality is an overarching aspect, and that can be used when you're looking at all of the other metrics, density, network completeness, network access, is what is the quality of the network when you're thinking about all of those metrics. We have another poll here.
You know what? I think I might skip this poll so that we don't lose time for questions. So
great.
Think about it and Do it on a wavelength telepathically to us, because we are curious about this one. And if you want to type in the chat pod some of the ones you've used, that would be great. But I do want Kim to talk just briefly about the measures as well.
So the measures are what we use to assess the connectivity methods. So we have some fact sheets in the guide on each of these emerging tools that can be used to look at bicycle and pedestrian network connectivity. I'm going to ask Hannah to advance to the next slide here. And you can see an example of what these fact sheet looks like. They describe the modes, the methods, the outputs, the level of effort, a description of the tool, some background, and then a graphic of what the visual output looks like. Gives you a highlighted peer application, and then some advantages and considerations. So we have these for each of the measures that we popped up on the previous slide, and they're designed to help you pick which tool is going to be best for your job.
And again, I think I'll sadly skip the poll, even though I am really curious about that. But it does sound like people either are doing level of service and traffic structure analyses, or they'd really like to. And I'm going to guess that would be the answer to this poll about what measures people have used. But I do encourage you to read through the guidebook and flip through those really beautifully designed fact sheets that Kim and the ALTA team put together, because I think they provide a great overview. And then you can drill down in the performance measures guidebook to get even more depth on the technical tools needed. Joe, do you want to take us through just the last step of the packaging the results piece of the process?
Happy to do it. So once you've done all of this work of assembling data and calculating the measures, it doesn't just spit out these pretty graphics that Kim has been showing you. There's a last step of packaging these results that you really have to think of along the lines of your planning question. And I'm going to give you the three kind of basic types of a way to package these results for you to think about. The first is the most common, and that's just a visual analysis. So you calculate the scores for your all of your network, and then you display them on a map and make kind of a qualitative comparison of where the gaps and opportunities are. Downside being that it's hard to make objective comparisons over time. And on the next slide, you'll see another possibility is to summarize all the connectivity of all of those routes or all of those facilities and summarize them to a small area. And these small areas don't have to be administrative boundaries like they are here. As Kim showed, they can be kind of emergent areas that have similar levels of connectivity. This is easier to compare over time and overlay with other data. And finally, some analysis measures and methods allow you to calculate the sum of the entire network score. Here you see People for Bikes, Bicycle Network Analysis Tool, which can give you a score that's comparable over time or different planning scenarios for the entire network. And on the next slide, the last step, this is the exciting part. Once you have calculated and measured connectivity over your planning area, there's so many other questions you can ask of it by overlaying other data to match your priorities. Questions about safety, questions about who benefits from connectivity to what level, and questions about whether your regional access priorities are being met by your network. And I'll hand it over to Hannah to finish us off with some lessons learned and state of the practice. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Joe and Kim. This has been great. So I think some of the takeaways we saw from the research and from the case study applications had to do with, for instance, the importance of defining that goal up front. And I would very much encourage you to not limit yourself to analysis goals that you know you can study. Try to set some goals that might stretch your resources. Think through how you could meaningfully address them so that you're not setting yourself up for failure, but don't let the data that you already have drive, then limit the amount of questions you really want to try to answer. Do something that's meaningful and strive to make it happen and collect the data you need and get the resources together to really look at it. Pay attention to the data standards. This is where Atlanta's example was very helpful of looking at regional agreements, regional online portals and libraries that they've set up that allow for consistency across localities throughout the region for defining and storing data and so forth. That's super helpful. Thinking ahead about tracking over time. This is one cautionary tale for not getting too fancy and doing something that then you can't replicate, or too simple that doesn't take into account things that you really may want to be thinking about. So trying to define some measures and metrics that you feel comfortable replicating over the years, and that you're not going to get dramatically different results if you modify it slightly over time. And then finally, just doing a lot of dry runs. Use your Unified Planning Work Program funds or other resources, or experimental money or pooled fund resources from Federal Highway to test things. Try doing some validation and secondary research. Make sure that what you're seeing on your results is really reflecting what's really out there. And take a look at what you're getting from several different perspectives using some of those overlay tools. So with that, I'll open it up. Dan, can you tell us if any questions have been coming through the hotline there that we should address in our 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, and we've got a couple minutes. We can take some of these, and I encourage you all to check the website and the link to the PowerPoint slides. We have full contact information for our panel, so if you want to reach out directly, we'd be happy to relay those questions. A few questions related to maybe from agencies that have not used either level of traffic stress or level of service for bicycling or walking, and just curious about how you would generally, how they would think about making the decision with which of those models to best use, which would be most applicable to their scenarios. I guess between LOS and LTS, do you have any sort of rules of thumb of a selection criteria between the two of what you typically recommend an agency use?
Kim, why don't you take that? What are the pros and cons and differences between level of service versus level of traffic stress?
At a really high level, LOS is given an A through F score. Level of traffic, and is sort of a black box type model. Level of traffic stress is 1 through 4, and it's a lot easier to unroll the metrics and understand what is within them. So it tends to be a little bit more user-friendly. One of the criticisms is peer-reviewed literature has not validated the model yet, and that ADT is not always incorporated. However, LTS can be used really nicely at the corridor level and also works as a design framework tool. So it's one that we tend to recommend for urban areas. Some of the problems come with more rural scenarios, but there has been some work by agencies such as CDOT and ODOT that have been working to think about some of those questions. Okay, great. And so in terms of data inputs for both of those models, would they be fairly similar, or would maybe lower access to less data or fewer data points that we kind of shared earlier, the range of options, would that steer, if you had fewer data points to work with, would that steer you toward one model over another? LTS requires fewer data inputs in terms of motor vehicle volumes and parking. Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And I just sent out the link to the page where you can find some of our archive material in case you all would like to look at that. The slides again and the recording will be there. I think I'd like to close out with a question, getting back to this issue that seemed to be of most interest to our audience of quality of network. Did this topic, clearly you can measure network connectivity, but then if you're seeing that your quote network is really just a lot of shared facilities that aren't as comfortable, is this a topic that came up again and again when you were developing this resource? And would you say that even more than the presence of these facilities, it's really, you need to look closely at how high quality are they, and are they really prioritizing comfort for different road users? That seems to be where this is all coming back to, is yes, you can have a network, but it really does need to be high quality.
Yes, I would say that was a pretty universal issue. I think the folks on the line know that the American pedestrian and bicycle network has been sort of it was usurped a long time ago by the roadway network for automobiles that was urgently needed, and we spent a lot of the 20th century working on that. But it's sort of interesting that our models and our tools and our planning processes have a fundamental assumption that's unspoken, that the roadway network for drivers and cars is comfortable by default. And we put a lot of thought into the way we design roadways so that drivers can operate on them comfortably with enough room to see, and they're not going to run off into trees, and all sorts of thought has been put into that. We need to put that same level of thought in terms of design, in terms of slope, in terms of all of the weather, in terms of all of the types of issues that are unique to people that are operating outside of a metal box. In that same level of thought. And some of these tools begin to get us towards routinely incorporating that kind of level of thought and detail into designing bicycle and pedestrian facilities with the same rigor that we already use and are very good at in designing automobile-oriented facilities. So I know we can get there because we know how to do it. We just need to apply it to these other contexts.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the Q&A portion of the presentation, but I would encourage everyone to reach out to us if you have other questions. If you are able to take a look at the slides that we posted on the website and then the recording, which is coming, if you'd like to review the material, I would really encourage everyone to take a look and read the guide that's just been published. Again, it's only about a month old, so it's got a lot of really good information there. And again, contact us if you have other questions that we can help answer. I want to remind you that an email.
We're happy, and Dan, if you wanna share them with us, if there were things we couldn't get to today or things that come in, please feel free to contact the project team and Gary. We're happy to answer questions anytime.
Definitely, and you'll have an opportunity actually as you exit the webinar. There'll be a brief survey there. We'd like to hear your thoughts on the session today, but there'll be an option to list out some more questions that you may have. So feel free to drop those there. We'll review those and hopefully get back to you in that way. We'll kick them to our panel, our expert panel here. But thank you all for sitting in with us today. It's been great. You're going to have an email coming to you later today with information about the archive, where you can find some information about other webinars that we're doing and a few other things. So keep an eye out for that. I just want to say thank you again to Gary Jensen, Hannah Twaddle, Kim Voros, and Joseph Broach for all their presentations today. And thanks to all of you for sitting in on today's webinar. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.